Traian Băsescu, the current president of Romania. He was elected president in 2004 and is now well into his second term. He has previously been mayor of Bucharest and also Minister of Transport. In his early career before entering politics, he served as a captain in the Merchant Navy, and we'd just been talking before we came. He's emphasized this has given him quite a pragmatic approach to some of the political issues. The topic of his talk tonight is the Romanian experience of welfare policy, highly topical in the European context, in which we discuss the role of the state, the role of social solidarity in a context of recession, in a context of seeking further growth. After the President has spoken, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Vladimir Tismaneanu, from the University of Maryland. He will say a few words as discussant, and then we'll be able to open it up to questions and answers from you, the audience. We're on a tight time schedule, so I will say very little more, simply to indicate, as you may have already understood, we've invited the President to speak in Romanian, and then there will be a translation available as to what of the President's speech, and then we will revert to English for the questions and answers. So, as time is short, can you please join me in giving a very warm LSE welcome to the President of Romania, President Basescu.
Honestly speaking, I avoid to use English language in my speech, simply because I don't like to see tomorrow in Romanian newspapers criticism about my poor English language. For this reason, I will transfer this mission to a good translator from Romanian to English language. Thank you for your understanding, but it's difficult to be in London and to use English language.
It is an honor for me to open the Ionescu series of conferences. To us Romanians, Professor Ionescu has been a major figure among intellectuals in exile at a time when Romania was under a totalitarian dictatorship. I thank you for the invitation to address you here in one of the most prestigious institutions in the field of social sciences. Many Romanian students have studied or are still studying at LSE in a truly international and competitive environment. Professor Ionescu analyzed the regimes such as the one that governed my country for 45 years from a theoretical perspective. I would like to address this issue from a pragmatical perspective. As understood at the time, politics was seen to be not primarily a set of arguments of principles, but rather a sum of promises. Communism promised people that they would be happy. The ideologists of the single party promised a society free from inequality, repression, conflicts, exploitation, and systemic crisis. But in reality, it all turned into a historical failure. And we could all see the evidence around this. Disparities were deepening. Repression had reached mass proportions. Conflicts were only suppressed inasmuch as their actors were suppressed. Citizens citizens were exploited by the state itself in the name of a new type of freedom. The system was in a permanent crisis. Unable to eliminate the state as it had set out to do, communism settled for weakening it. It cancelled respect for the rule of law in the name of a partisan justice. It eroded the legitimacy of state institutions and pushed for a false modernization whose negative effects we're still experiencing today. The advent of the post-communist period did not translate into the complete disappearance of this view of politics. Many people expected a new miracle from the state. The hope that the state should ensure our happiness was gradually replaced by the idea that the state should provide for the welfare of each and every one of its citizens. My conviction is that politicians should not promote stereotypes nor be seduced by the spirit of utopia. Societies are made up of individuals that should be responsible for their own destiny. This statement leads to another, this time about the main role of the state, that of guaranteeing the supremacy of law. The state must be an impartial, fair arbiter, and it is its duty to provide for the protection of its citizens. The economic downturn we are currently going through has revealed the fact that the lives and liberties of many people are constrained by a totally different type of state, an interventionist state which uses huge amount of resources and which is based on an oversized bureaucracy. But I leave it to specialists in political philosophy the task of debating the strengths and failings of different types of states. I will just point out a fact that we are all aware of. The global crisis has shown us how vulnerable those states that interfere too much in the workings of the free markets really are, especially those who interfere with labor market or with social programs that are often unnecessary. A notable professor of the LSE, Friedrich Hayek, declared that the system of private property is the most important guarantee for freedom, not only for those who own property, but even for those who do not own property. Just recently, the tendency has been that of blaming the capitalist system for everything that went wrong during the crisis. No doubt, capitalism can be improved, but I cannot help but wonder what would have come of those countries of Eastern Europe and perhaps of the continent as a whole had the current economic crisis hit inflexible and centralized command economies. The current situation is more serious than purely economic calculations can indicate. Before anything else, democracy must be sustainable. Severe chronic deficit levels, ever higher levels of debt, and a punitive tax system are incompatible with the principles of the rule of law and values of liberty and individual responsibility. It is not the free market that is an annex of the welfare state, but rather it is the welfare state that depends on the proper functioning of the free market. Politicians politicians are constantly tempted by one thing, that of allocating benefits to certain groups of voters in order to ensure their support in the next elections. This leads to considerable vulnerability for the entire society, as representative institutions can then turn into instruments of certain groups instead of these institutions working for the public good. The spiral of unjustified benefits thus becomes self-perpetuating. The disproportionate focus on the politics of welfare can also be approached from another angle, that of a crisis of values. There is this temptation to focus inwards on a limited sphere of consumption and benefits, and to support different variants of protectionism or isolationism. Yet modern democracies have had a sense of their historical mission. They favored peace rather than war, and trade rather than isolation, and thus democracies created an expanding space where freedom and individual rights have become key values for millions of people. This peaceful and generous spirit lies at the origin of the European Union. Though we are now members of this club of advanced democracies, we have not reached this stage in the same way that our partners in Western Europe have. Looking back in history, we notice that Western states have become democratic over a long time span. From the beginning of their modern existence, Western countries have usually established the rule of law, a competent administration, and legitimate institutions. They enforced the respect for individual rights even before the triumph of political equality and the principles of sovereignty, the sovereignty of the people. Unlike this fashion, certain states in Central and Eastern Europe, and Romania is one of them, reinvented themselves in a very short interval after 1989 to become electoral democracies. This is the context in which we should understand the direction of their development, that towards the creation of strong, legitimate institutions based on the rule of law. In this sense, the strengthening of democracy implies moving from a form of procedural democracy to a consolidated democracy. This is a complex process. Romania's experience, just as that of other post-communist states, has shown that the process of reforming the state has taken longer than we expected back in 1990. There is a paradox of certain state apparatuses which promote revolutionary changes at political, social, and economic levels, while retaining a high degree of inertia in their own functioning. And this leads to the disheartening of that part of society which supports change, and it also leads to state institutions losing credibility. It is against this background that populism thrives, and this was a topic of concern for Professor Ionescu as well. Together with Ernst Gellner, he had observed that populism is the ideology most frequently adopted by leaders of new states. If socialism had promised a diffuse, idyllic happiness to be attained when communism would be completed, after 1990, the promise made by the new democracy seemed to relate in many people's minds only to the tangible satisfactions of Western welfare. this association left room for frustration when the economic boom did not happen as expected, or when it did not benefit everyone. Anti-establishment parties and parties led by former members of the communist system swiftly capitalized on discontent as they focused on encouraging statism and collectivist reflexes inherited from the previous period. One of the ideas that we are now trying to develop in Romania is that democracy and its quality depend on the individuals and the role that they freely and responsibly acknowledge in society. Democracy is not the regime of the state, but that of the citizen. Perhaps the most remarkable thing that happened in a very short period in Romania is the strengthening of a democratic political culture. Ever since the 19th century, when the modern Romanian state was created, our political and cultural elites have been pro-Western. The Soviet occupation and the domination of the single party could not suppress this orientation, which became again the main element of consensus of the Romanian elite in the 1990s. There is thus a continuity in our orientation that has also been supported by maintaining contact with the West. And Western radio broadcasts, including the BBC's Romanian service, had the most direct impact on the majority of the Romanian public. Please consider these thoughts, imperfect as they may be, as a contribution to the discussion from a man who's asking himself about the system of values that should support its attitudes. Only through a committed dialogue will we acknowledge and find solutions to the challenges of today's world. This is where academics play a crucial role. They challenge preconceived ideas, they develop people's mindsets, and they bring cultures closer together. Each of you can do more than all politicians can do together. Do try to understand Romanians, just as Ionescu, a Romanian, succeeded in understanding the Western society and your political system in the second half of the last century. Just as Eastern Europe still needs foreign investment, it also feels the need for intellectual investments. I can encourage you in this sense, and by assuring you that you will find plenty of originality there, as well as the surprisingly large number of things that we have in common. And I will conclude with this message of optimism. The extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in today should not lead us to dogmatism nor to a lack of hope. Another great professor of the LSE, Michael Oakeshott, stated that in politics, men sail boundless and bottomlessly with neither harbor for shelter nor floor for anchorage. And seamanship consists in adjusting traditional manners of behavior in order to make a friend of every hostile occasion. Together, we will rise to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The leadership of the London School of Economics, to John Gledhill, who was so efficiently involved in organizing this event, and I'm under the impression of this wonderful lecture on statecraft and on political imagination. I was writing down what was, and by the way, if people think that I've been involved in writing this speech, only very, very marginally, so it's new to me. So I'm commenting on a new thing, so this is President Basescu's specialty, to come with new things, and it is, I think, quite interesting. I was asked to comment for a very brief. So the first thing I'd like to say that I was impressed by the President's references to Ghiță Ionescu's legacy. In 2013, we are going to have probably here a lecture, and I want to thank Mircea Mihaescu, who is present here, Vice President of the Romanian Cultural Institute, Horia Patapievici, Dorian Branea, for the idea of having lectures in memory of this great, probably the most important Romanian political scientist of the 20th century. I can speak loud. Okay, so I think it's a very, very important thing, and I applaud this. The second thing, I listened carefully to President Basescu's speech, and indeed I think the most important thing that emerges from this speech and from the experience of East Central Europe, including countries of the former Soviet Union, is the transition from the state in which the law was mentioned, but it was trampled underfoot, to the countries that we call rule of law type states. From what President Roman Herzog, and he condemned communism in East Germany in his speech in front of the Bundestag, called from Unrechtsstaat, the state of non-law, to the Rechtsstaat, the state, the rule of law. This is precisely the most important challenge. It bears upon everything that defines the political culture of post-communism, and I think that President Basescu in his speech gave a number of very important points about how to address this. One of them is the recognition of the centrality of liberal values and the centrality, if anybody, I teach at the University of Maryland, and I tell my students, if you are waked up at 5 in the morning and you are asked what is the only word you think about when you say socialism, and I say, I don't know. I said, it's equality. What is the first thing that you are waked up, God forbid, at 5 in the morning and somebody asks you, what is the first word that you think about when you say liberal democracy? It's the individual, the liberty of the individual. This is the key issue. Without the individual, we have whatever you have, but you do not have liberal democracy. Okay, this is extremely important, I wanted to emphasize. Listening to President Basescu's speech, so I'll leave aside my notes here. Listening to President Basescu's speech, I remember probably one of the most, here we are, the London School of Economics and Political Science. One of the most important writings ever in the history of sociology and political science, of course, the 2 lectures that immediately after World War I, Max Weber delivered. Of course, I'm sure that most of you have read them. One is called Politics as a Calling, Politik als Beruf. The other one is called Science as a Calling, Wissenschaft als Beruf. Okay, in that particular series of lectures, 2 lectures, Weber said that there are 2 types of ethics, 2 types of morality. One is the morality of the absolute ends. It's the morality, if you want, of the utopian social engineering, in which, in the name of a nebulous, superb goal, all methods are accepted in order to achieve that particular goal. The other one, Weber said, and it's the hallmark of the true political personality, is the ethics of responsibility, in which you accept gradualism, in which you accept the non-perfection of human nature, in which you accept the fact that you deal with individuals as they are and not as a particular ideology wants to transform them into. So this, I think, this speech was an invitation to political and social and moral responsibility. It is not outside ourselves that the choices take place. It is through our own actions, through our own intervention in history, through the individual. These are not just nice words. This is the way, basically, modern democratic communities have been built and have been fostered and have been defended. I mean, the fact there was a war in the 20th century between totalitarianism on the one side, be it black, be it red, be it whatever color you want, and the democratic liberal communities, basically it was linked to the definition of the rights of the individual. And one of them is the right to be free in his or her own choices, not to be dictated by some self-appointed group of custodians of human happiness. Ghiță Ionescu, whom I happen to be quite close to, and whom I dedicated my own history of Romanian communism to, which is called Stalin's Fall Seasons, in 1964, Professor Ghiță Ionescu published his History of Romanian Communism. Ghiță Ionescu, born in 1913, worked also for a number of years as director of the Romanian department of Radio Free Europe in Munich. Between 1959 and 1963, he was the director of Radio Free Europe. He believed he was a true European, as is President Băsescu, and he emphasized as much as possible the fact that there are a number of values based on which Europe was constructed. As a matter of fact, and I'll end up with this because I'm very interested in the Q&A part of this event, as a matter of fact, Europe is not simply an economic project. Europe is a civilizational and moral project. If it fails, the European project, it's not simply an economic project that has failed, it's a moral and civilizational project which is basically threatened. And this is something that we all somehow have to be cautious and aware of. This is a struggle during the 21st century between a Europe which would be a liberal democratic model or a Europe that can somehow collapse back into a form of barbarism. The President's references to populism should be, I speak here to the students, I'm a professor, so I'm apologizing that I speak as a professor. The references to populism are extremely important. When you have demonstrations in the heart of Madrid, when you have demonstrations in the heart of Santiago de Chile, in the name not of political parties, but other vague ideals and values, then this is the beginning of something that we have to reflect upon and try to understand what they mean. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you to both of you. In my rush with the introduction, I should have mentioned, in fact, that I myself was a student of Ghiță Ionescu, and I would like to endorse everything that has been said about his contribution to political science, but also the care and attention which he paid to students in his university. So I'm delighted that we are commemorating his memory. We have a number of themes now to pursue in the Q&A, and themes clearly of a philosophical nature, the role of the state, individual responsibility, but also perhaps some specific policy questions as to how we apply the philosophy on contemporary issues and dilemmas. So we have, I think, about 25 minutes for questions and answers, and this should be plenty of time for you to make your contributions. There are colleagues here with the...
Professor,
please.
With your permission,
yes.
Eventually, if the auditors have questions, any type of questions about Romania, I don't like to keep you in a very narrow area of questions.
Okay. That's very generous. So you now have even more freedom. The President has said that it's a matter of individual responsibility, but hey, you have much more freedom to express your views. I think I would like to take a number of questions at a time, if this is okay. There are colleagues in red with microphones. We'll need this for various purposes. I should explain that, like all LSE lectures, this is being made into a podcast, and so that's an additional reason why we use the microphones. Could I take the gentleman here first, please? Could you identify yourself and then ask the question?
Thank you very much. My name is John Palmer. Many years ago, I studied at the school, but in more recent years, before my retirement, I was political director of the European Policy Centre in Brussels. And I wanted to ask the President, if I may, if he could develop his thesis of the choice between liberal free democracy on the one hand, with the concerns about social solidarity in the face of crisis on the other, and in particular, how and where Romania stands on the debate inside the European Union. Some populists say we should scrap social programs in the European Union including social programs designed to help the new member states. Others, arguing from social solidarity, believe they should be strengthened. And I wonder where, in Bucharest, and you in particular, Mr. President, where you stand on that debate.
Thank you. Could we take the gentleman right at the very back?
I can answer.
Could we just take...
Keith Raffin. Mr. President, how do you respond to what might be described as the prevalent view within the European Union and among its leaders at the moment that Romania was admitted prematurely to the European Union because of inadequate progress in tackling both corruption and organized crime? And does it embarrass you that in our press constantly, again today, there are references to corruption and organized crime in both Romania and Bulgaria, and that it is not being tackled fast enough? And this is now becoming such a dominant theme that in fact it may well be regarded as delaying the entry of other applicant nations, because it was felt that Romania was admitted, as I say, prematurely, without sufficient negotiations and safeguards on the judiciary, on law and order, on organized crime, and on corruption.
Okay. Let's answer to first two questions. Well, the solidarity must be one of the main characteristics of a European society. But the solidarity, if we talk in terms of social protection, must function like a result of a performant and competitive economy. If we like to build first the solidarity, allocating huge resources for solidarity, but don't having a performant economy, for sure, sooner or later, the échec of our policy is guaranteed. And we already have examples in Europe with countries which put in front of any policy the solidarity, a so-called solidarity, which was the engine of borrowing huge amounts of money to support this social protection system, and on the end, the economy don't generate the necessary resources to be solidar as large as we want to be solidar, or as large as the politicians like to declare that they are solidar sometime with entire nation. For example, in Romania, before crisis, 13 millions after out of 20 millions were in one or another way assisted in different assistance programs which were guaranteed by the state. Of course, we were obliged to cut this money and to try to focus the existing resources, and mainly the resources generated by Romania and not borrowed from outside. We were obliged to focus these resources for the categories which really need a support. Why we reach such large number of assisted peoples in one or another way? Simply because the politicians, as I said in my speech, each time when the elections were close, they start to become generous with the money which were not produced by Romania. For this reason, I will conclude my answer saying that no social state must be generated by a competitive economy, but a competitive economy can generate a social state. First condition is to have a performant economy, a competitive economy, and you will be able to generate like a result of this competitive economy and a social state. Otherwise, the collapse is guaranteed, in my opinion. Of course, no excuse for the governments which don't look at the peoples, which cannot provide resources for daily life. For this category of peoples, we have to assume the responsibility of providing adequate social protection, but not a generalized protection generated by political interest, which on the end will push the state in an extremely difficult solution. And with your permission, I will extend a little bit the answer, because I like to transfer to you some information about Romania. Maybe I succeed to change some of your bad impressions about my country. For example, in 2010, we were in what we understood from this crisis. The essential thing which we understood is the fact that there are three categories of expenditures which must be controlled. First category is regarding the costs of the state. And we decide to reduce dramatically the cost of Romanian state. We reduced 140, we took out 140 employees of the state. 140,000, excuse me, 140,000 in 1 year, and the process is continuing. We reduced the social assistance with 10%, and we will continue to look at the categories which really need this social protection. We issue a new wage law which adjust the special wages, like, for example, where different categories with special laws for wages, like policemen, like judges, like doctors, like many other categories. And we cancel all old laws which was generated by political decisions in order to capture the goodwill of some categories, and we reorganize the wage system in Romania. On the pensions, was a system with special categories. We cut everything, we start from zero, and we arrange the pensions based on the contribution during the life. Another area, labor force code. We changed the labor force code, making the relation between employees and the owner of the company in a direct connection. Until this new labor force code was a contract at national level, which was negotiated by the leader of unions with the government, and all the companies were obliged to pay what the politicians negotiate with the unions. Now, based on the new labor force code, each worker have to negotiate with his company, with the staff of the company. Or that means we try to make each Romanian responsible for his life. We try to destroy this story that the state will provide to the Romanians the life of the Occidental peoples without of having performances of the workers of the economy from Occident. Here is, in few words, what we succeed to do last year. I have to admit that we lost huge on the pools, but we put Romania back in track with a consolidated fiscal situation and with the process which is continuing and in 2011 in order to reach our objectives to provide to the Romanians good conditions based on a performant economy and based on a state which is not interfering the life of each one. Of course, were some protests in 2011, but no so strong than to block our reforming process. Regarding preparation of Romania for being EU member state. Of course, I don't like to be arrogant. I don't like. In general, I don't like the arrogant peoples. But when we became EU member state, I have the feeling that some EU members were more corrupted and more prepared, less prepared than we were to be EU member state. In same time, coming at the Romanian realities, we know very well that we have to push, to continue to push the reform of judiciary system. Last year we adopted 4 new codes for justice. The implementation starts with 1st of October this year. We will completely change our judiciary system in order to provide reasonable final results on the court. I will not say unfortunately, because we have a cultural tradition, but until 1st of October this year, we are still below Napoleon Code. And now we became a little bit more Anglo-Saxon in judiciary system. In same time, is like a man which passed through all functions in administrative system of Romania. I can say that by several times, the excessive bureaucracy was confused with the corruption, and is an area where we are working to simplify our bureaucracy. And in another hand, I have to admit that the corruption was an element joining our transition period. Now we fight with all force of state against of this phenomenon. And if you follow Romania, you will see minimum on the newspapers. If you don't know somebody which is involved on the system, you will see that huge progresses was reached in last period, in last 2-3 years. For example, was unbelievable 5 years ago to see a politician arrested or condemned. Now members of parliament are condemned, former ministers are condemned, ministers was replaced from the government at the request of prosecutors in order to be judged, and so on. I know we have a lot to do. In same time, I ask you to trust on us, because we will do what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Too long answer, Professor.
Not at all, not at all. I should also say, of course, that in the UK we've had recent experience of parliamentarians going to jail, but let's not dwell. Let's go upstairs. The gentleman in the centre, please. No, the gentleman behind you, I'm sorry.
There are several gentlemen.
Okay.
I'll pass it on to you afterwards. Should I ask the question in English or Romanian?
Okay. Just say who you are and then ask the question, please.
Okay. I'm Mihai and I studied sociology here. I just finished. This is a question, I think, more for Professor Tismaneanu. Thank you both for your speeches and very, very few observations. First of all, Professor Tismaneanu, thank you very much for using Weber's two types of ethics. I read that in my sociology course and it was really interesting. And so from my understanding, the first type of ethics deals with a system of values. You do an action because your system of values tells you that it's good to do it, and you don't really think about the consequences because you already did good. And the ethics of responsibility asks that when you do something, you think about the potential consequences and try to minimize the problems that might arise. My understanding is right? Okay. So in this context,
we need the question.
Yeah, very quickly.
You passed your sociology exam, I'm sure.
I need to get a signature on that. Okay, so in this context, I'm not at all surprised that we're talking about the social welfare state in these terms. What I'm really surprised about is that a crisis of capitalism, which we've spoken about today, has led to the strengthening of capitalism and has led to the possibility of saying that we cut workers' unions, we cut social security as successes. So my question, I reached my question, how much do you think that the decisions to cut social security and unions were influenced by the IMF conditions after we took the two loans? Thank you.
It's a question for me. No, it's a question for you, not for me.
Well,
you negotiate with IMF.
These cuts are not successes, are sacrifices. And in one hand, reflect the situation where a state can come if the populism is working like ideology in a state. When the politicians are not responsible, keeping the expenditure in line with the economy performances, with the resources generated by the economy, you will reach for sure the moment when you will be obliged to cut. I repeat, was not presented like a success, was presented like a reality in connection with the populism. That's all. And with IMF or without of IMF, no way. Look at the countries. United Kingdom is not under IMF agreement, as I know. And they operate cuts.
Thank you. Can we take the lady here, please?
Hello, my name is Clara Valintiru. I'm a PhD candidate here at the LSE and the Romanian. And I wanted to ask you about your recent comments on the problem of political clientelism in public institutions and also political parties. You've denounced it, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think the sources of it are in the Romanian society?
What
the sources? The
sources?
The causes.
Causes.
The causes.
Thank you.
Are in connection with the mentality. Each party, when came in power, tried to place his peoples in all areas. What we decided will happen, for example, on the large, we still have large state-owned companies in energy sector. What we decide was, before the end of the year, to privatize the management of these companies. And the competition for a management team for each company will be organized starting with September, October, November, December. We have to cover all large state companies with the private management. In other area, is on the state structures, where the governments usually change not only ministers and secretary of state, but they change even the directors in different central institutions. This will be stopped. This year we will have in place, is already a kind of agreement on the coalition in power to promote the law fixing the functions which are changed when the government is changed. And the solution, political solution, will be to stop these changes at the level of Secretary of States and chief of different national agencies.
Thank you. The lady in the center here, please.
Thank you. My name is Elena Mega, and I have a question for Mr. President. You talked in your speech about the importance of and the significance of investment in human capital for Romania. And you talked about academics and professors that can promote democracy and make people understand that democracy is the system of citizens and not the system of state. And my question is, what has Romania done in, let's say, what has Romania done in, let's say, the past 5 years, or what Romania is going to do in the next 5 years to promote the investment in human capital, so to sustain those professors, academics in being involved in policy making and influence people's mentality, as you said. Thank you.
Yeah. Out of general approach, let's promote the young generation, which is a slogan used around the world by the politicians. We do something in very practical things. As you know, the Romanian education system is not the one having the poorest quotation in Europe or on the world. It's a system generating enough good specialists. And Romanian labor force is well known at being a well-trained labor force. Even in these conditions, we decide to change the education law. Education law was approved in 2010, is an extremely revolutionary law, classifying the schools at all levels, classifying the teachers, classifying the result of the students, and we consider, and having as main objective training the youth to have competencies, knowing to do something after each stage of the education. This is the general way how we consider we can create chances for the youth, for the new generation. I don't know if my answer is enough to you, but I consider that we change the education system with the extremely revolutionary law, which will guarantee to our youth a chance in life.
We have lots of hands. I wonder, are we okay for 2 more questions, Mr. President?
That's the one.
Yes, of course I accept, but is a blonde lady there.
Bine ați venit in Londra, Traian Băsescu.
Bine v-am găsit.
I love your country very much. I am a huge fan. I have been working there and traveling there for 20 years. But I am very sad to see so many millions of your young and brilliantly educated, talented people leave and come and work overseas. So many of them, it seems to me, have little intention of returning. We talk of why or whether Romania was ready to join the EU. It seems us in the West have benefited hugely from Romania being in the EU. We have your doctors, we have your nurses. But how long can your country sustain this mass exodus? You educate them and they leave.
We get the question, thanks.
It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. And I don't know if I will have an equally good answer. But, for example, we fight as country. Even today I discussed with Prime Minister Cameron about free movement of labor force. Of course, Romania have the disadvantage, don't having same wages like in UK. And being in position to promote the idea of free movement of labor force, we cannot say to the doctors which obtain £5,000 per month in London to stay in Romania for 500 euros.
I worry it will make me very unpopular.
Just a moment, because I don't finish. I have in the bad part in my answer. But what is revolt? What is revolting us? Out of 27 EU countries, 9 countries still have restrictions for Romanian and Bulgarian labor force. Okay, we can understand that. But are limited restrictions. Weekly in Romania are organized workshops for recruiting doctors, for recruiting IT peoples, for recruiting engineers, for recruiting architects, exactly for these countries which have restrictions for Romanian labor force, which means something is unfair in this process. If they need our doctors, why don't accept our Roma?
I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay.
And I visited the Roma that Sarkozy kicked out, and they live in desperate poverty.
You. Thanks very much. We're not inviting you to give a speech. Could we invite the gentleman here as the last question, please?
Thank you. I'm John Glenner from the Department of Government, Mr. President. On the subject of Roma, they're a community that privileges the individual and the community over the state in a way that is consistent with some of the messages that you've argued for. But they're also, we know, a community that suffers from severe social problems. So do you think that the state has a responsibility to attend to some of the social issues that the Roma community faces?
Yes, each state has responsibility for his citizens. And we have to admit that, for example, in Romania officially, we have 500,000 Roma. In real terms, we have more than 1.5 million. 1 million are certainly integrated. They don't claim anymore being Roma. At the last census, we were surprised to see that in Romania remain only 500,000 Roma. We have a problem. It's a long story regarding the efforts of the state, and I will not blame the communist period when was a period when a part of this Roma were integrated on the society. We continue after revolution, after 89 revolution. We don't succeed. We have responsibility, but at the same time, we cannot accept a treatment for them like for second-hand citizens. We have the responsibility, but at the same time, they became Europeans when we became EU member states. And putting them on the plane and sending them in Bucharest is not a solution. For example, in Spain and in Italy, we succeed in one or another way to find a solution at the governmental level. In one hand, we provide these countries with Romanian policemen, in one hand. In another hand, we succeed to reach the agreement sending teachers. which is not the case around the Europe, because why we consider so important to send teachers? Because the main problem of this minority is the education. As mayor of Bucharest, I try to provide them with some jobs. It was quite impossible out of cleaning activities because they were with zero school. The most important objective which we have now is convincing the Roma families to send the children to the school. If we will generate another generation with no school, we will perpetuate the situation of this remaining unintegrated Roma. But I will add something more, and probably this can be a subject of debate. For example, in Roma family, there are 3, 4, 5, 6 children. And we introduced in this last year a condition to pay the allowance for the children if they go to school. Otherwise, we suspend the payments. And
as the President has been emphasizing that the UK economy, like others, needs to make sacrifices, then let me prepare you that the gift is a very modest gift. Because, of course, you wouldn't expect anything else from an academic institution in the UK. So we have a tradition, and the tradition is that we give you something to remember the London School of Economics by. Now, you're all wondering what on earth am I going to take out of this bag? But let me suggest one of the most valuable things we could give you from the London School of Economics is precisely the baseball. In addition to that, Mr. President, we'd like to give you this, which will commemorate your lecture here at the LSE, and we hope that you will remember your visit with much fondness. Let me give you that as a gift as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, it is our custom on these occasions to please ask you, the audience, to remain in your seats for the moment whilst the President leaves. But once again, can we give a very warm thank you to the President for his lecture. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting me here, and thank you very much for being with me for